Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Bob and Avram for participating in this important initiative. My name is Eli Rubenstein, and I'm the religious leader of Congregaton Habonim, the first synagogue in Canada founded by Holocaust survivors after World War II. Our Toronto congregation has hosted a number of programs related to First Nations issues in the past. In fact, the following significant inscription appears in the lobby of our newly appointed synagogue building. Quote, "Our congregation, founded by Holocaust survivors, empathizes with the centuries-old struggle of Indigenous people against discrimination, persecution, and injustice. We extend our hand in solidarity and friendship to our First Nations neighbors and join our hearts with theirs as they rebuild their communities and their historic lands." A few weeks ago, the members of my community, indeed most of Canada, responded with shock and horror to the devastating discovery of the unmarked graves of some 215 First Nations children, some as young as 3 years of age, at the site of the former Kamloops Residential School. Once the largest residential school in Canada, it was operated by the Catholic Church from 1890 to 1969, housing as many as 500 children at one time. This discovery may only be the tip of the iceberg. There are thought to be dozens of similar undiscovered burial sites near locations of former residential schools all across Canada. At least 150,000 Indigenous children pass through the residential school system. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they existed, quote, to primarily break their link to their culture and identity. At least 140 residential schools existed in Canada, the first one founded in 1831, with the last school in Canada closing in 1996. Today, there are still many survivors dealing with the difficult long-term effects of the residential schools. The children taken from their families and communities were placed in these residential schools, meant to divorce Indigenous children from their histories, culture, and language, to kill the Indian in the child, as the infamous quote goes. Often, the child was also killed, as has been said. In the case of residential school victims, physical and sexual abuse and neglect were rampant. Cramped close quarters, poor nutrition, lack of medical care, and separation from family community made these young residents extremely vulnerable to illness, especially infectious diseases like tuberculosis. Many were buried in unmarked graves, and in all likelihood, their names will never, ever be known. Their families ultimately never knew their fate, and were left wondering what became of them. There's a value you find in almost all cultures and religious systems. Adults are supposed to protect children, and our vulnerable children are supposed to be cherished and nurtured by the adults that surround them. In the case of the residential school children, it was the exact polar opposite. One group of adults preyed on defenseless children, while the other adults, their parents, were powerless to protect them in the face of this brutal governmental assault. The pain felt by these children and parents, torn asunder from each other, must have been truly immeasurable. As I come to the conclusion of my remarks, let me just say this. Justice will not be served until every Indigenous child who is buried in an unmarked grave behind a residential school is found, and every attempt made to identify them and return their remains to their families. Justice will never be served until the Indian Act and every other form of systemic injustice against Indigenous people has been abolished and replaced with laws that treat Indigenous people fairly, and then all forms of systemic racism in Canada. As moral human beings, it is our obligation to think and to act as allies to the Indigenous community and to do everything we can and are called upon to do in the name of justice. Let me conclude with one last heartbreaking story a few years ago. In this story, a First Nations woman is recounting how she was removed from her home as a young child by a federal agent who picked her up in a float plane from a remote northern community, which was accessible only by air. Her parents were told that their daughter would return in the near future. She recalled as a young girl being in the float plane as it was taking off, seeing her parents standing on the shores of the lake waving goodbye to her. Her parents grew smaller and smaller as the plane climbed higher and higher until they were just two small dots in the distance, and then they simply disappeared. She was never to see her parents again. This image has always haunted me. A little child being seized from her parents with a false promise of eventual reunification. Imagine the pain of that child, that one innocent child, and imagine the pain of her parents, each never knowing what happened to the other. Then multiply that experience, not by dozens, not by hundreds, not by thousands, but perhaps by tens of thousands or even more. And then, just then, you might begin to understand the tragedy, the pain, the injustice of the residential schools. This permanent stain on Canada's history can never be erased, but the consequences we are still feeling today, they can be addressed. If we all learn and acknowledge history and pledge to join our First Nations brothers and sisters in commemorating this devastating tragedy can help bring healing to this historical injustice. Then and only then can reconciliation begin. On the way, not so long ago, we, the Jewish community, uttered two important words which emerged from our pain-stricken hearts. These words were, never again. By this we meant, should we ever see grave injustice happening to ourselves or to others, we would not be silent. We would stand up and let our voices be heard. Tonight, never again is beginning. Let us continue on that road well into the future until all children are cherished, protected, and safe, and playing freely in a playground of peace. Miigwech, Lech LeShalom, go in peace.